There, I hope everyone can see that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Doria. I'm very excited to be talking to you about chronic illness inclusion today. And I'll be focusing on the research that forms the background to our work, as well as areas where we think more work is needed. So as Doria said, we began as a 3-year research project called the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project, which involved myself, my colleagues Jenny Lyas and Steph Benstead. It wasn't a university-based project, but it was part of a UK-wide programme of research called DRILL, which stands for Disability Research into Independent Living and Learning, which was led by disabled people for disabled people. And for me, this was really fortunate because I had to give up my PhD years ago now due to chronic illness. So here was a chance for me to go back to doing research that had developed out of my own life experiences with chronic illness. My colleague, Dr. Anna Ruddock, is probably the person who I've worked most closely with in terms of communicating our findings, and is co-author of our report, Energy Impairment and Disability Inclusion. I'm delighted that Anna will be speaking about parts of our research report, as well as her own work for chronic illness inclusion into experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the subject of our study was the chronic illness community, of which I'm a part. And this is really a network of online communities that connect through social media platforms and assembles around hashtags. This graphic shows the terms most commonly related down here in the bottom with the hashtag chronic illness. These are the kind of topics of conversation that come up most commonly. And if you belong to this community, you'll know what a spoonie is and what spoon theory means. And you might use the hashtag NESI void, which stands for no end in sight void, to find fellow travellers on your chronic illness journey. And you'll probably relate to this cartoon about the relationship between doctors and patients that's gone completely viral on Twitter in the past couple of weeks. But if you're not one of us, you've probably got no idea what this is all about. So let me explain. My background to this was working in policy research on disability in areas of welfare, social care and employment. And I was struck during this work that there's never any mention of chronic illness. It's like we're completely invisible as a group of disabled people. There's nothing in the policy literature that references our experiences or addresses our needs or talks about what it is to be a spoonie. Over the past 10 years, I've also become a disability activist. I learned about and embraced the social model of disability, the basis of disability rights. But disconcertingly, it appeared that the disability rights movement I so admired was also silent on the experience of chronic illness. In fact, the very term chronic illness is a kind of taboo word within the movement. And conversely, many in the chronic illness community feel that the social model of disability doesn't really address their situation. So that was the puzzle that drove our research. And the questions motivating us were, what is it that binds our community? If we are indeed a distinct group of disabled people, why are we not on the disability map alongside our brothers and sisters with other impairment types? We have this vibrant grassroots community on social media, but why are we only talking amongst ourselves? Why don't we have outward-facing organisations advocating for us like there are for mental health and autism, for example? So I'll tell you the conclusions of our research. The common ground that unites us, our community, is twofold. There's a shared lived experience of disability that's more profound than and defies the language that we have to describe it. That's why you get these metaphors like spoonie, which is a metaphor for having to ration limited energy. We also have a shared experience of oppression that unites us. Oppression that we resist with the kind of memes like this one about doctors and patients. And this oppression at its core is about disbelief in our experiences of disability. We believe it's a disbelief that's structural and systemic. So we have these two problems: invisibility as a group of disabled people and systemic disbelief in our experiences. And we believe that the two are bound up with each other and perpetuate each other. So I'll explain how we got here by talking you through our research. In terms of our methodology, we combine qualitative and quantitative research. And for the qualitative data collection, we created a new kind of online research space, a forum that allowed us to run a focus group, but one that was extended over time and that allowed participants to join from home. And this was done for reasons of accessibility, because people with chronic illness are to some extent or other housebound, which is why they interact with other people online so much, and need to have forms of participation to join from home, but also that can accommodate fluctuations that are inherent in chronic illness. So we needed a non-synchronous type of research forum. So for this purpose, we used a focus group software that in many ways replicated the kind of natural habitat of a Facebook group that people with chronic illness belong to, but one that allowed for more privacy. And if you're interested in finding out more, we've written about this research methodology for a forthcoming book on co-production in health and social care beyond COVID-19 that I've listed up here. So our process was to ask a simple initial question to spark conversation and encourage connection between participants so that we could step back and allow themes to emerge through their discussions. Our focus group included 20 participants that were selected for having different diagnoses and varying levels of severity, as well as a mixture of age and gender, because we wanted to make sure our findings weren't about a single disease experience, but a broader experience of chronic illness. And our focus group lasted 8 weeks. And from these discussions, we distilled a set of themes, experiences and thoughts that bonded people together despite their different diagnoses. And they started from a very simple question: do you consider yourself to be disabled? Oh, that's, my slide's gone slightly wrong there, I don't know why. But, so this question prompted a tangle of ambiguity of yes but no but type of answers. And hopefully they're going to all come up in order. So participants said yes, because fatigue is very disabling. And it's the thing that made me stop working. It's the thing that makes me not even able to have a shower. But society doesn't think that fatigue is a disability. So fatigue ranks lowest in the hierarchy of disability. So even though I know in myself to be disabled, that I'm disabled, I don't fit the socially constructed view of a disabled person. I feel like I'm not entitled to identify as disabled. And when I do, people judge me with suspicion and disbelief. So these are the themes that we explored further in our survey to see if they were valid for a wider sample. Our survey drew responses from over 2,000 people with chronic illness. A quick note about who our respondents were. They were largely drawn from online chronic illness networks. Nearly all of them met the legal definition of disabled, and the largest demographic group was women aged 40 to 65. 9 in 10 said their impairment was usually invisible, and nearly all listed a physical health condition, but 2 in 5 reported a comorbid mental health condition. In fact, comorbidity was a striking feature of this sample. Respondents listed an average of 3.5 different conditions. And you can see from this word cloud which were the most common conditions. So then we asked, what's the most restricting feature of your health condition, which is graphed down here in the bottom left-hand corner. We listed fatigue and limited energy separately because our focus group participants were really clear that these were not necessarily the same thing. But if you take both fatigue and limited energy together, it was by far the biggest group. 43% of respondents said fatigue or limited energy was their most restricting feature, followed by pain at 27%. So this validated our focus group theme of that fatigue is the most disabling feature for a wide range of health conditions. And Anna's going to talk to you later on about the survey responses where we looked at social attitudes towards disability and disbelief. But first, I want to explore this finding about limited energy and fatigue a bit further, because I believe that our data tells an important story. We asked about impairment type as well, as opposed to medical diagnosis, and nearly 3/4 ticked the box labelled impairment of stamina, breathing or fatigue, which was kind of unsurprising given the other results about fatigue and energy. So asking about impairment rather than diagnosis is important, as I'm sure you all know, for social and public policy. In order to promote human rights and equality for disabled people, policymakers need to know about the impact of a condition on activity and participation in order to develop programs and services to address needs. And stamina, breathing and fatigue is a category recommended by the Office for National Statistics for social research on disability. And in the rare occasions when it's used in a government survey, we find that it's a very large group. As you can see down here, it's 1 in 3 disabled people. It's second only to mobility impairment in size in all age groups, and among working age disabled people, it's the 3rd largest group. But as a category, you almost never see it used. Here are some examples of common classification schemes for impairment types. The first on the right here is the scheme used by the drill programme that our research was funded by, and on the left comes from recent research by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And both of them roughly divide up impairment along the same lines: mobility, mental distress, sensory impairment, learning disability. You never find a category that references fatigue, stamina, or energy limitation, despite the fact that it's such a large group of disabled people. It's almost like our existence as a large group of disabled people is erased from the landscape of research and policy development on disability. So is it any wonder that policies from social security to social care and employment fail to address our needs? And our focus group participants were right. If there is a hierarchy of impairment and disability, fatigue is not just at the bottom, it's absent altogether. So how can we explain this invisibility of our experience in social and public policy? An idea that I have that needs further development, but I think it has to do with the scientific status of fatigue in medicine and the authority that medicine has within society. An analysis of peer-reviewed publications involving fatigue that I cite here at the bottom found that there's no scientific discipline of fatigue in the way that's developed recently for pain. There's no overarching theory that can investigate how fatigue is qualitatively and biologically different in different diseases. There are no biomarkers for different fatigue states, and there's no framework for differentiating fatigue within normal healthy populations from fatigue within chronic disease. And with energy limiting chronic illness, there's a vicious circle of underinvestment in biomedical research and medical ignorance about the cause of symptoms of chronic illnesses. And now we have another classic energy limiting chronic illness with long COVID that's appeared on the scene. It remains to be seen whether there'll be proper investment into biomedical research into long COVID, or whether it will be swept under the carpet and treated with positive thinking programs, as happened with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. No wonder then that fatigue is associated both by the public and health professionals with a subjective state, something you can just push through with willpower, not with objective loss of function or impairment in the way the chronic illness community describes. And when you do a search on the internet for images of fatigue, nothing more clearly illustrates this fact than the images you find, some of which I've collected here, of well-groomed office workers looking a bit sleepy, nothing to do with people like the ones who took part in our focus group, who often couldn't manage to shower or dress or feed themselves. But perhaps most tellingly of all is the World Health Organization's work on classifying diseases according to their impact and restriction on participation, which is a really important guide for social policymakers in developing programs of disability support. If you search for fatigue, stamina, or energy within WHO's classification of impairment, the only place it appears is under cardiorespiratory disease, whereas our research shows that energy limitation is a main feature in many disease groups: neurological, musculoskeletal, endocrinological, and several more. It's not just present in asthma and heart disease. So we believe that this erasure of our experience that's rooted in mainstream medicine is bound up with attitudes of suspicion and disbelief that our focus group participants talked about, that Anna's going to develop further. I'll just finish by explaining that we developed the language of energy limiting chronic illness and energy impairment as part of our participatory research, because participants felt that the term fatigue was part of the problem of the stigma and the disbelief that they faced, and that we need a new language as a broad group to reframe our experience and make it visible. So the term energy impairment is deliberately referencing an objective loss of function, not the subjective state of tiredness that many people think about with fatigue. And when we spoke about reclaiming chronic illness back in 2018, this is what we meant. It was about asserting our self-identity as disabled people and giving more precision to the term chronic illness and demanding that our experiences be listened to. So next I'm going to hand over to Anna to explore the dimensions of disability identity and disbelief. And I'm happy to keep working the slides, Anna, if that's all right with you.
If you're up to it, Catherine, that would be great. Thanks. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I do just want to stress that none of this work would have been possible or happened without Catherine, and that continues to be the case. She is an extraordinary driving force behind all of this and is doing immense work on behalf of many, many people. So, Catherine, we all appreciate you very much. In this next short section, I'm just going to pull out some voices. You know, we talk a lot about how participatory this research was, and so it's important to us that you really hear some of the voices who took part. This quote for me, it really sums up a lot of what we found. So I'll read it out. It says, "I feel like every day I am battling to prove myself, that I am really this sick, that I'm working hard, how exhausted I feel, how difficult things are for me, in order to avoid their judgments. But it feels like standing on the beach with a bucket, trying to stop the tide coming in. No matter how hard I try, I can't help their comments and attitudes creeping in and making me question myself." Next slide, please, Catherine. So exclusion is one of the key themes of our research findings. And as Catherine has already said, and is reflected in this quote, people told us that it certainly feels as if there is a hierarchy amongst disabled people, and that those of us that show little or no outward physical signs are at the very bottom. So the main form of oppression reported by participants was invalidation and disbelief, and that was expressed and experienced in different ways. We found that disability is still stereotyped as a fixed and visible form of difference. And I think this point around fixed is really important. It's encouraging that we're seeing more language around the idea of dynamic disability, but we still have a long way to go. And the sense is still often that disability is something that you have, and you have it in the same way every day, and it affects your life in the same way every day. And obviously there are enormous swathes of people for whom that's just not the case. And as Catherine has very eloquently described, pathological fatigue is generally dismissed as a universal experience of tiredness. And this is certainly something that people suffering with long COVID are currently encountering. Next slide, please, Catherine. So in terms of identity and what it meant for people to consider themselves as disabled and to outwardly identify as such. So 25%, a quarter of the respondents who met the Equality Act definition of disability said they didn't identify as disabled, or they weren't sure if the label applied to them. Around 60% said that they feared negative reactions from others if they did identify as disabled, and 43% of respondents agreed with the statement, "I feel like an imposter if I identify as disabled." One respondent told us, "I still have an issue with self-esteem and feel that if I identify as disabled, that someone with a, quote, worse or more visible disability will think badly of me for taking resources away from them, or that people might think that I'm faking it for attention or to get concession theatre tickets, or that I'm lazy and I want to sit down." And this for me raises an issue that I think is yet another factor of the chronic illness experience, which is that people aren't only experiencing the symptoms. We're not just experiencing biological symptoms that arise in our bodies. So much of the experience of these types of illness is in the response of others and how that feels and the impact that goes on to have on one's sense of self and one's experience of being in the world, essentially. So in terms of these microaggressions of disbelief that people describe to us, this quote sums up quite a lot. Someone told us, "I thought, oh, I just get tired more than other people, and it must be because I'm fat or unfit or lazy. And I blamed myself. And teachers or employers would assume it was my fault too, tell me to get fresh air, go for a run. this experience, this past experience still makes me feel a fraud today. I forget that fatigue is literally part of my illness, and my gut response is, oh God, I'm just being lazy. I should do some activity. These are very powerful norms. 92% of our respondents said that they always or sometimes had been told that they didn't look disabled. And I think there used to be a meme in the early days of social media, oh, but you don't look sick. 80% agreed that the public's general attitude to energy limiting chronic illness is that everybody gets tired. And 83% always or sometimes met with the attitude that they should basically just pull themselves together, try harder to overcome their difficulties. One quote that I think really struck us is the example of someone who described their experience. The first time I used a shop mobility scooter, the person in the store when I was collecting it said loudly, "You don't need this." And I've never hired one again. So 64% of our respondents avoided asking for help or support because they feared exactly this situation and being dismissed as fraudulent. And 81% frequently or sometimes felt anxious about being watched or being judged when out in public. There's a lot of self-monitoring of one's own behavior. How is one being perceived? Is one behaving almost as though they are disabled enough? And what does that do in terms of how people live their lives, what they consider themselves having the right to do? So some conclusions, and I really hope that those of you who are interested will take the time to look at the full report, because there's obviously much more content there. Some of the conclusion we have drawn are that identifying as disabled takes time, and it also involves a labour of self-belief, because it demands a resistance of powerful social norms and stereotypes about who is disabled and who is not. It involves navigating hostility, dismissal, and disbelief, and crucially overcoming internalized invalidation. And in my experience, it takes a long time even to get to the point that you can recognize internalized invalidation. This is long-term hard work. It means asserting the lived experience of impairment, as Catherine said. And it means that we need the Chronic Inclusion Project to exist, essentially. We need advocacy to support people living with LC, to recognise and claim their rights as disabled people, if that's what they choose to do. Next slide, please, Catherine. So I just wanted to take the last couple of minutes to share with you a bit of work that my partner and I did on behalf of the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project in response to a call that I'm sure many of you saw and possibly responded to from the Women and Equalities Committee last spring about the impact of COVID on people with protected characteristics. So in April 2020, we conducted a survey and got quite a staggering 776 responses in, I think, 2.5 weeks or something, from within the chronic illness inclusion community, many of whom had participated in the previous research. And they are overwhelmingly women. And this is we could have a whole other webinar, I think, on this, and I hope at some point we will, because this is largely about women and women's experience. And what we found was we already had a population at increased risk from COVID-19 due to underlying chronic conditions, but there are a lot of people who are not included on the government's highest risk list at that point. And these people's needs, there were basically a lot of people with chronic illness fell and continue to fall between the gaps in policy provision in response to the pandemic, both generally and specifically for disabled people. And people's needs were being ignored and their health and well-being was deteriorating. And I think it's important to stress that this was the case in April 2020. It was, looking back on it, we felt in some ways that we were in the thick of it, but we were at the beginning, and things were very bad very fast for a lot of people. So we found that 86% of our respondents reported that the pandemic had had a negative impact on their ability to access food and essential supplies. And this was the overwhelming issue, especially in those early days, And it was very much linked to the fact that the demand for home delivery of food rocketed because the general population suddenly needed that access. And many people who relied on it in order to eat, in order to survive, had conditions that were not explicitly named on the shielding or the high risk list that supermarkets were using to manage access. And so we had some, really heart-rending comments from people who could tell you exactly how much food they had left in the house, and they did not know how they were going to get any more supply at that point. 66% reported disruption to routine care, healthcare during the pandemic. 56% reported that their health had got worse since the pandemic began, and they spoke a lot about the detrimental impact of stress and anxiety. And many people described experiences of discrimination and ableism in shops, in the NHS, the media, and in public conversation. People reported feeling unseen, unheard, and unvalued. People were frightened, essentially. And now we're a year on, and we're really keen to do some follow-up research a year later with this group of largely of women to say, what has happened. We're kind of 3 lockdowns later. We all know that gender inequality is being exacerbated on every possible front. And so this is bound to be the case for people living with chronic illness. We have seen a similar issue about falling through the gaps with regard to the vaccine priority groups, and particularly group 6, where people with underlying conditions are not being invited for vaccinations because their specific condition is not listed, despite the fact that the guidance tells GPs to exercise their clinical judgment. The compounded impact of homeschooling on women who were already dealing with energy impairment. So many angles. And so we're really keen to do some follow-up work. And this is a general shout out that if anybody is aware of any sources of funding, please do let us know. Next slide, please, Catherine. So I'm just thanks for listening. I'm going to hand back to Catherine at this point, just to wrap up and tell you a bit about the direction in which CII is headed.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so I just want to wrap up. Anna said some great closing comments about our research, and it was also so good to hear about the other piece of work she's done more recently, and how that really needs to be followed up now that we're coming to the end of this pandemic. So just to finish off, Chronic Illness Inclusion has now become a disabled people's organisation that's about people with different diagnoses, or no diagnosis at all in some cases, coming together under a common purpose. And that purpose is disability, equality and inclusion rather than medical treatment. Now, this isn't to say that we don't want medical research, treatment and cure for our diseases, but we also need to influence policy and legislation to ensure that our lives here and now as disabled people have equal value. So chronic illness inclusion is about breaking this cycle of invisibility and disbelief. And we believe and hope that by adopting the new language of ELCI and energy impairment, this is part of the strategy of breaking that cycle. And we're really keen to have conversations with yourselves and others in policy, working in policy areas, to get your feedback on what you think about this terminology. Because only by putting ourselves on the map as disabled people can we develop individually confidence in ourselves, in our rights as disabled people. And only then can we join together in solidarity with other disabled people and fight for our common causes. Now, as I said, ELCI is about much more than fatigue. And this is part of the subject of our forthcoming report, which is on social security and employment with energy limiting chronic illness. We discussed the multidimensional nature of energy impairment that includes ideas of payback or post-exertional malaise, cognitive dysfunction and various forms of fluctuation, and how these features interact with work. And our report is launching on the 27th of April, and we're holding a webinar as a launch event. So if you're interested in coming to that and learning more, do go to our website. It's all listed up here. Sign up to our mailing list, and we'll be promoting that and inviting people to attend very soon. So thanks, that's the end of my talk.